Welcome to Keystone Cold Cases, a podcast that aims to reignite cold cases across Pennsylvania. We are here to bring attention to the stories that have faded into the background, honoring the victims and their families along the way. Each episode is a step closer to understanding the truth, because every case deserves more than just a passing glance, and every voice deserves to be heard.
Hey everyone, this is Lindsay, and I am here with Shannon. How are you doing tonight?
I am good. I am excited for tonight's episode because it's my favorite time of the year. I love fall, and we're covering your spooky.
I know, that's the only good thing about fall. I'm dreading the cold, but I can deal with the spooky. Today, we're going to dive into one of Pennsylvania's eerie and fascinating pieces of folklore, known as the Pittsburgh Vampire Panic.
I will be honest, I have not heard of this one, so I am going in completely ignorant to this topic.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, so I'm excited about this just because it kind of brings in a little bit of the lore and understanding how it kind of mixes in with some of the diseases that we had back then. So, and when you think about it, it really wasn't that long ago.
Right.
So,
right.
when this all took place. So before you think about vampires are just movie monsters like Dracula, The Lost Boys, or Twilight, we're going to rewind to a time when beliefs of vampires were deadly serious. So we're going to picture Pittsburgh in the early 1900s. And if you know anything about Pittsburgh, it was a booming city known for its steel mills, coal mines. The skylines were rising. So it was a good time to be there, and a lot of families were coming there from all over the world to kind of live the American dream. So the iron rails, roaring furnaces, the rivers had lots of barges carrying the steel. It was just a really, really poppin' place to be. It was a place of opportunity, but there was also a lot of hardship. So immigrant families had poured into the city of Pittsburgh from the Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Italians, Irish. Each community was carving out a little piece of home in unfamiliar streets. They lived in tight row houses, often with too many people under one roof, and they worked really long, back-breaking shifts in the mills and factories. Wages were meager, hours were long, and industrial accidents were common. Yet hope still lingered. They were hopeful that their children might live better lives and that the sweat of today would mean comfort of tomorrow. But alongside all of this promise, there was an invisible threat lurking in the shadows: disease. One of the most feared illnesses of the time was tuberculosis. So they called it back then, they called it consumption, which I've heard of consumption before, but I'll be perfectly honest, I didn't think that it was tuberculosis. I don't know what I thought it was, but I was kind of ignorant to that, which is crazy because where I work, I have to get TB tested every 2 years.
Okay,
it's
yeah.
like part of our regulations. So it's something that's very common in my world of like hearing about it, but I didn't realize what it was back then.
And it's been, I don't want to say gone, but like, I guess dormant for so long. Like, it's not been a public nuisance like it was back then for such a long time. And it's like low key making a comeback.
Yeah.
I've heard of, more cases of tuberculosis over the past few years than I did like throughout my entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think they used to also call it the White Plague. So I just didn't realize that that's what it was. All these years of being tested for it.
Yeah.
It's just part of our, when you're working with people closely, they, most programs make you get tested for it. So, anyways, it is a slow, cruel, and relentless disease. People could be coughing on day one and then bedridden the next day. It came on really quick. Families watched helplessly as loved ones wasted away. Their strength was draining. Their faces became pale. Their breath rattled with blood. Entire households were struck, sometimes losing multiple members in a matter of weeks.
Wow.
So, when science failed to explain what was going on, superstition took over and filled the gaps that people were missing. So imagine losing a husband, then a daughter, then a son, all in quick succession. This is what was happening to families back when this was running rampant. Doctors offered a little more than rest and fresh air as the treatments. The other treatments rarely worked in crowded neighborhoods of Pittsburgh. So desperation, grief, and old world folklore mingled together until something strange, something terrifying, began to seem plausible. So things that they were knowing as folklore was like, maybe there's some truth to this.
Right.
People began to think, what if it wasn't just disease? What if the dead weren't really resting? What if they were coming back, draining the life from their own families? So it does kind of sound like a horror movie, but many families in early Pittsburgh, it was a terrifying reality. And that fear led to desperate measures. Bodies were exhumed, hearts were burned, stakes were driven through corpses, all in order to protect the living.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, I mean, it was, we're talking over 100 years ago, and the leaps in medical science that have happened between now and then are like just mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I wanted to point out is a lot of this was still going on in 1949, which was not 100 years ago.
Oh my goodness, no, it was not.
Right. So when you think of, I mean, most of this was like the late 1800s, the early 1900s, but later on we kind of look at how it kind of continued into, I think the latest exhumation was like 1949. When you think about how far we've come in a year or in 100 years, like it's crazy. But when you think about how like close it is in history relative to, the history of the world, it's like not that long ago.
Right. My dad was born in 49. So, I have a stake, pardon the pun, in the year of 1949. You know what I mean? So it's just crazy to think about that they were doing that, when my dad was born. So.
Yeah. So today we're going to dive into this strange chapter of Pittsburgh's history. So a story blends fact, folklore, fear, and a very real public health crisis all together. So along the way, we're going to look at some other vampire panics in New England and across the United States to just have a little bit of understanding of how these beliefs traveled, why they mattered, and what they reveal about the human response to illness and grief. So let's start with the basics. What do we mean by a vampire panic? So in modern times, we think of vampires as Hollywood creations. They sparkle, they fall in love with teenagers, they stalk castles in Transylvania. But if you rewind just a little bit, vampires weren't entertainment, they were explanations. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, across rural Europe and eventually America, people genuinely feared that the dead could harm the living. This wasn't about pale aristocrats with fangs. It was about neighbors, relatives, or loved ones who had recently died, often from mysterious illness. The disease more commonly linked to vampire panics was tuberculosis. So back then, tuberculosis wasn't well understood. There were no antibiotics, no germ theory widely accepted by people. Families just saw the effects. One person would get sick, then another, as though something or someone were draining their vitality. They would say that people just looked drained.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it, when the plague and everything, one day someone's fine, and the next day their face is sunken in, they're super pale. It just looks like the life is being sucked out of you.
Yeah.
So the idea of vampirism became kind of a folk logic. So it was folklore that they're trying to explain why things are happening. Here's how it often went. Someone died of consumption. Then another family member began to waste away. Instead of chalking it up to a contagious illness, families sometimes believed that the first person was somehow feeding on the living from beyond the grave. That belief led to actions. Families, often in secret, would dig up recently deceased. They would inspect the corpse for signs of vampirism, what counted as evidence. Well, a body that looked too fresh, lips that seemed red, blood in the chest cavity or heart, or nails and hair that appeared to have grown after burial. Of course, today we know that these things are natural results of decomposition. Bodies buried in cold or dry conditions decompose more slowly, skin retracts, making nails and hair look longer, blood can pool or liquefy, the lips might redden as tissues break down. But to grieving families in 1890 or 1910, these were chilling signs that the dead weren't really dead. So even at this time, they didn't even have an understanding of decomposition. It wasn't widely studied.
Yeah.
So once they believed they had proof, families performed rituals to stop the so-called vampire. These varied by culture, but common practices included driving an iron rod or wooden stake through the heart or chest, decapitating the corpse, burning the heart, lungs, or other organs, reburying the body in a new orientation, sprinkling garlic, salt, or holy water into the coffin. So those are a lot of the things that we see in our movies today.
Right.
Sometimes the ashes of the burned organs were mixed into a drink and given to the sick relatives as a kind of folk cure. These remedies sound gruesome, but they were acts of desperation, attempts to stop an unstoppable disease. It also shows, like, how desperate they were that they're mixing ashes of their loved ones. I couldn't imagine.
Right. Back then, I mean, I think at that point when you don't have the understanding, you try everything to save your family. Probably nowadays would resort to something, far-fetched that other people might not understand. But like you said, it's desperation. So you'll try anything to save someone you love from dying or being to that level of illness.
Yeah, and you have to remember too that they're not just losing one person; they're at times losing their entire family to this.
Right.
It's really sad when you think about it like that. So it's easy to dismiss these families as superstitious, but when we think about the context, without modern medicine, faced with devastating losses, people turned to the tools that they had. Folklore, rituals, community memory. That's what historians and folklorists call a vampire panic. And they weren't just European tales, they happened right here. If we're going to understand Pittsburgh's pandemic, we need to take a look at some of the best documented cases of this phenomenon, and those came from New England. So the most famous story is that of Mercy Brown, who was often called America's last vampire. Mercy was a 19-year-old girl from Exeter, Rhode Island. In 1892, she died of tuberculosis. By then, her mother and sister, they had also already succumbed, and her brother Edwin was gravely ill. The Brown family and the neighbors grew convinced that something unnatural was happening. So on a cold March morning, the townspeople exhumed the Brown family graves. Mercy's mother and sister were reduced to skeletons, but Mercy herself looked eerily well preserved. Even more shocking, when they cut into her chest, they reportedly found liquid blood in her heart. To them, this was undeniable proof. Mercy was a vampire. So this kind of goes back to what, they didn't know about decomposition.
And I assume they were not embalming at that point either.
Yeah.
It would make sense if she still had blood in her body, if it wasn't drained and replaced with embalming fluid like we do today.
Right.
Question for you. She died in 1892 and was exhumed in March. But when, in relation to her exhumation, how long was it prior to that she died? Do you know? Was that March 1892?
I think it was just days.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it was just days because her brother was ill and we'll see in a couple minutes.
Okay.
So I don't think it was a long time period. I think it was just a matter of days.
Okay. So they're just making the assumption that she looked well preserved, but she really just recently died. So there was really nothing happening with her body between the two events.
Yeah, I probably should have looked into that a little bit more, but I just assumed that because the brother was ill that it was all kind of relatively the same.
Yeah, which makes sense.
Right. And it depends on time of year, too. Like, was it a humid summer? Or I guess March isn't humid, but, it depends on how moist the air is, and who knows.
And you're talking Rhode Island, 1892 March, clearly a lot colder than the March mornings we experience here in the Northeast. Like, we're not quite as far as north as Rhode Island, but, temperatures have definitely, changed since then. And they had a lot more snow at that time, I'm assuming, and, just had much more extended bouts of lower temperatures than we do these days.
Yeah. Yeah, I probably should have looked into that a little bit more, but my assumption was just that it was relatively close since Edwin was gravely ill at the time. And who knows, maybe she looked really sickly when she passed, too. And they were comparing it to that.
True.
Because I think I mentioned something earlier about how like lips can look redder during decomposition.
Yeah, right.
And I think that was one of the biggest things that they had said about her, was that her lips were red. In a desperate attempt to save Edwin, the townspeople burned Mercy's heart and liver, mixed the ashes into a tonic, and had him drink it. Not surprising to us, but Edwin still died shortly thereafter, as this was not a good remedy to cure him.
That's a shame.
Yeah. So this case captured national attention at the time. It was covered by newspapers across the country, sparking fascination and horror. Today it remains the most famous American example of a vampire panic. But Mercy wasn't the only one. Scholars like folklorist Michael Bell has documented more than 80 similar cases across New England in the 18th and 19th century. For example, the Ray family in Vermont in 1817. Multiple members of the Ray family died of tuberculosis. Neighbors had exhumed the bodies and burned the organs in hopes of stopping the disease. Another one was the Corwins in Massachusetts. In one case, a child's remains were exhumed and treated with rituals after siblings continued to fall ill. And then the Griswold family of Connecticut in 1854. Archaeological digs have revealed burials where corpses were rearranged or mutilated post-mortem, almost certainly linked to the vampire beliefs. So each of these events followed a similar pattern. A family was ravaged by disease, a community was desperate for answers, and then rituals meant to restore balance. What makes these cases important for our Pittsburgh story is that they established a cultural precedent. By the time immigrants from Eastern Europe brought their own vampire folklore to Pittsburgh, Americans had already had their own set of rituals tied to the tuberculosis. So we have to remember, too, that a lot of our folklore come from European culture. So we had already started having our own rituals in New England. So now we're talking about kind of the melting pot of Pittsburgh with all those other cultures that I mentioned that are going to be coming up with all these new ones. So the New England panics, with their burned hearts and folk cures, became part of the broader cultural imagination. And in Pittsburgh, a city thick with both disease and diverse immigrant tradition, these ideas took on a new life. So now we go from New England's vampire rituals to stories of vampires in Pittsburgh. At the turn of the 20th century, Pittsburgh was an industrial magnet. The steel mills drew immigrants from all over Eastern and Southern Europe. Many of these communities carried centuries-old vampire folklore with them. In Romania, for example, the strigoi were restless spirits thought to feed on the living. In Hungary, tales of revenants, the dead rising from their graves, were common. Slovak and Polish traditions included their own versions of vampires and protective rituals. So one thing I thought was interesting, so I read this one book and they would talk about the strigoi all the time, and I thought it was like completely made up. I didn't realize that it was actually part of what Romanian called their spirits that feed on the living.
Interesting.
I read that word and I was like, oh, I always just thought it was like a made up, a fictional thing in a story I read. So if there's any other readers here that have read, I think it was Vampire Academy, that they talk about the strigoi all the time. So now you know it came from Romania. So when these families settled in Pittsburgh, neighborhoods like the South Side, Polish Hill, and the Hill District, they brought not just their language and food, but their beliefs. So when tuberculosis began tearing through their crowded homes, those beliefs found fertile ground. One of the most enduring Pittsburgh vampire stories centers on a woman named Agata Petrova. So according to oral tradition, Agata was a Slovak immigrant who died of tuberculosis around 1913. Soon after her burial, other members of her family fell ill. Neighbors whispered that Agata was not at rest, that she was preying on her relatives from beyond the grave. The story goes that her family, in desperation, dug up her body. What they found terrified them. Agata's corpse looked too fresh, her lips were red, and her eyes appeared open. To stop her, they drove an iron rod through her chest before reburying her. So again, very similar to the New England story.
An iron rod. Crazy.
Yeah. So this is, probably partially where we get, and I think Dracula and stories like that, I don't know when they came out, but this seems very similar to how we kill vampires in our modern day stories.
Yeah. Just from a personal perspective, and I know that this is a long time ago and we are so much more advanced medically, but I honestly don't think that there is anything that could coax me to dig up a loved one's corpse right now.
Yeah. I don't.
I mean, it's a little different. Burials are a little different
Yeah.
than they were before, all the red tape that you have to go through in order to exhume. And then there's normally that cement crypt that the casket is loaded into and stuff. So it's not just redigging the hole and pulling the casket out anymore. Anyway, so
I don't think there would be anything.
right.
But I think it's hard for us to speculate because we have so much more knowledge now.
Right.
That it's hard to say. If I was desperate and if I believed that vampirism was real and that I could stop it by doing this, I might have.
Oh, for sure. Like, and I agree with I agree with the concept. I'm just not going to be the one to do it.
Yeah, no, I get you.
Because every time you talk about it on this, I get like the chills right up my spine. I'm just like, oh no.
Yeah. And then to think then that you have to mutilate the body. Like, that's the other piece of it. That, like, okay,
right.
We're going to dig her up and look at her and see what happened. But now we have to take it a step further and mutilate the body in some way, shape, or form.
Right. It's like another level of tragic after what these families have already gone through.
Yeah. Like, I couldn't imagine the fear that they had, like, being truly afraid they were coming back from the dead. Like, I couldn't imagine that.
Yeah.
I mean, I get creeped out every once in a while nowadays with some of our, like, ghost stories. I couldn't imagine if there was, like, something that kind of explained it. Like, people dying and having essentially their life drained from them.
Yeah.
It definitely gives you the chills.
We're all wigged out over here.
I know, it's like really creepy when you start to think about it. So they didn't have a whole lot of newspaper clippings or like official records of this event, because people did this kind of in secret. Like they said in the previous story for Mercy, like they dug her up without telling anybody. They were exhuming people without going through proper channels.
Yeah.
And I think back then too, a lot of people were buried in their like own yards.
Right.
So it was probably easier. So it exists in folklore, passed down through families, retold in Pittsburgh ghost tours and local history circles. But whether or not Agata's exhumation happened exactly as told, the story does reflect a real cultural fear. There are hints that other exhumations, I can't say that word very well, happened quietly in immigrant neighbors, away from the eyes of the English-speaking reporters. So unlike the Mercy Brown case, which exploded in the press, Pittsburgh's immigrant vampire panics may have stayed largely within their communities. Because you have to remember, like, most of these people were immigrants. This was happening in immigrant parts of town. They definitely didn't want to involve others.
Right.
It was their folklore coming from their country and their culture.
Yep, and that's what they understood, and they probably, like anybody, would think that, the locals wouldn't get it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. What we do know now is that tuberculosis was devastating Pittsburgh at the time. So by 1910, the city had some of the highest TB death rates in the country. Immigrants were hit hardest because they were living in the cramped housing with little access to medical care. So it's no wonder in their grief, families reached back to old world traditions to try and protect themselves. So it's the stories that they knew,
right,
that they used to explain it. And I mean, and that's another piece of it that, I didn't really touch on in my writing, but they're in a new area. They're in a new land. They came here for work and a better life, and now they're hit with disease, and then the doctors have no explanation for it, and it's supposed to be a better life. We're supposed to be here for the better medical, the better, American dream.
Right.
And they come here for...
And that's what happens, right.
Yeah. So it definitely makes sense. The story of Agata Petrova captures that tension, the old and the new, the science and superstition, Pittsburgh industrial future colliding with ancient beliefs. So why do people believe that the dead were harming the living? So we're going to take a look at tuberculosis itself. So TB is caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is a bacterium that spreads through the air. So this was the early 1900s, before antibiotics existed. So it was one of the deadliest diseases in the world. Symptoms included weight loss, night sweats, coughing up blood, slow wasting away of the body. To the untrained eye, it looked as if something was literally draining the life force from its victims.
And you can see how communicative it was, because we all learned through COVID, like when you cough or you sneeze, those saliva particles can travel like up to 6 feet. So you had all these families in close quarters. So it made sense that, everybody was getting sick
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't really have the benefit of a lot of space.
Yeah, right. And these things happening so rapidly, could definitely, you would, if you had the folklore in the back of your mind,
Yes.
I could see how this could easily be thought of that they were, draining the life force. Especially because, like, the Romanian version of the Strigoi, I think it said that it was just like a spirit. It wasn't like an actual, how we perceive a vampire.
Right.
It was just a spirit that would suck your life away from you.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes a lot of sense when you take away the, like, Dracula look of a vampire.
Right.
Yeah, so then the way that bodies decompose added to the fear. So in the cold soil, corpses would remain well preserved for weeks or months. Blood pooling in the lungs or chest could give the appearance of fresh bleeding. As skin shrinks, the nails and hair looks longer. Gas buildup can cause bodies to shift slightly, even making noises as air escapes. So to grieving families, these natural processes looked like signs of vampirism. And I think that would probably explain why most of these stories that I found relating to this were all in New England, Pittsburgh. Like, they're all cold areas.
Yes.
So without modern science, people interpreted what they saw through the lens of folklore. What they couldn't explain biologically, they explained supernaturally. So it's easier for us now to kind of scoff, but to think about it. Even today, in times of crisis, people turn to rumors, folk remedies, and conspiracy theories when official explanations don't satisfy their fears. So vampire panics were simply the version that made sense to the communities a century ago.
And even a lot of people today still rely on things like the supernatural, like tarot card readings or psychics, things like that don't have a lot of scientific validity, but it's just something that people find comfort in.
Yeah. And I think, it makes a lot of sense too. We do, even today, we still go down the realm of the conspiracy theories or, listen to rumors when we don't agree with the official explanation. And we did see that through COVID. And I think I mentioned that a little bit further down, how it kind of all goes full circle.
Right.
To still relate to today.
Sure.
So Pittsburgh wasn't the only place touched by vampire folklore. In rural Pennsylvania, archaeologists have uncovered graves showing signs of post-burial tampering, likely linked to vampire fears. In some cases, skeletons were rearranged, ribs broken, or bones burned, all consistent with rituals to prevent the dead from rising. In one case from the mid-20th century, as late as 1949, oral accounts suggest that families still quietly performed exhumations in rural Pennsylvania when TB struck. These weren't widely publicized, but they reveal how long these beliefs really lingered for. Similar practices appeared across the country, especially in immigrant-heavy regions in New England. We've already seen dozens of examples. In the Midwest, Slovak and Polish communities occasionally carried out protective burials. Even in the South, whispers of revenants and restless dead made their way into folklore. What unites all these cases in the same motivation? When science couldn't save them, people turned to superstition, ritual, and hope.
Can I circle back to that part about the South?
Mm-hmm.
So we know that New England and specifically like Salem had like the witch trials and things like that. It seems like you hear a lot more of this stuff in the Northeast, just like, we talked about earlier. And I honestly, other than voodoo, I don't think I've ever heard of any type of supernatural like superstitions or practices come out of the South.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and I think a lot of, and I'm not super well versed on when like the years that the witch trials and things happened, but maybe it's just because the South is so much younger than New England.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Because I think some of that stuff was like the 1600s, wasn't it? Or 1700s?
Yes. I'm going to check it out now because now I'm curious.
Yeah, but I wonder if that's part of it, just because, like, yes, we had immigrants down there, but I think that they were just so much more prominent up here with the steel mill. Like, the work was up here.
Yeah, it was Salem witch trials, like that. The accusations were like between February of 1692 and May of 1693. And I know, like, because I visited New Orleans. I actually went down. It was 20 years ago in July because we went down the month before Katrina hit, and did a lot of the touristy stuff. Like, went to the cemeteries and went on the the nighttime like ghost tour where they gave you all the lore about the city. And the history of the city is that it was basically built by criminals and prostitutes, because I think it was I forget what king it was. I want to say Louis, and I don't know what number Louis was when they were settling that area, sent like the criminals and the prostitutes to settle Louisiana. And then so that's why there's such a rampant, what's the word I'm looking for? Not really supernatural, but occult, I guess, type of history down there. And then, of course, Madame Laveau and all of the voodoo stuff down there too, which is really fascinating.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. And I think that like this states down south started becoming states in like the later 1700s.
Right.
So that might explain part of why like the witchcraft wasn't so prominent down there, because it was almost 100 years later.
This is why spooky season's the best.
I love this stuff. All right. So what can we learn from Pittsburgh Vampire Panic and others like it? First, they remind us that folklore is never just silly superstition. It's a way of making sense of the world when other explanations fail. So families weren't trying to be gruesome, they were just trying to survive. Second, these stories highlight how grief drives people to do extraordinary actions. Digging up a loved one is unthinkable to us, but for them it was an act of love, a last-ditch attempt to save those that are still alive. Third, vampire panics show how cultural traditions adapt to new environments. Immigrant families brought old world beliefs to their new world struggles, blending them with logic, with local fears to create uniquely American vampire folklore. And finally, they offer a mirror to our own time. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw misinformation, conspiracy theories, and folk remedies spread just as quickly as the virus itself. That same desperation to control the uncontrollable still lives in us today. So the Pittsburgh Vampire Panic is more than just a spooky folktale. It's a glimpse into the lives of the immigrant families that were facing hardship, disease, and loss. It shows us how fear and folklore intertwine and how people try to wrestle control from forces that can't be understood. Whether Agata Petrova's story happened exactly as told or not, it endures because it captures the heart of human experience, the terror of losing loved ones, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, we can fight back against death itself. So the next time you walk through Pittsburgh's old neighborhoods or pass by a cemetery, remember, the past is closer than you think. Well, thank you for joining me tonight, and I hope that you learned something new.
I did. Thank you. Have a great night.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye. That's all we have for this episode of the Keystone Cold Cases podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and please consider leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to find out more about the podcast, the hosts, and the cases we cover, or if you want to suggest a case, please visit us at kccpod.com or send us an email at keystonecoldcases@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at Keystone Cold Cases and on Instagram and TikTok at KCCPod. Follow us on YouTube at Keystone Cold Cases, and please remember never to reach out to the family or friends of the victims, only to law enforcement if you have any tips. This episode was researched and hosted by me, Lindsay, and you can find all of our sources, social information, and contact information at KCCPod. Theme music by Darren Meekins and production assistance from Shannon Bickle. Join us again next week for another case to sleuth out.